Thank you so much for all of you for coming this evening. My name is Ann Thrupp, and I'm the Executive Director of the Berkeley Food Institute. And thank you. I'm really happy to welcome all of you this evening for this important event. We're really excited to be covering this important topic, which is one of the key themes that greatly concerns and motivates the Berkeley Food Institute, and that is cultivating justice in food systems. We're honored to have 4 remarkable speakers to address this important topic of justice as it relates to food and agriculture. How many of you, to start, are aware or know a little about the Berkeley Food Institute? Can you raise your hands? Okay, oh wow, we have a very knowledgeable audience. Well, I just want to say briefly, and some of you may know this, but Berkeley Food Institute is bringing together many different disciplines and schools, faculty, students, staff, and many others together around the campus who are working on food and agriculture issues. Our mission is to support transformative change in food systems to foster diversity, justice, resilience, and health. And we're working on that ambitious mission by supporting programs in interdisciplinary research and education, public education of this kind, like this evening, and linking research and education to policy and to community engagement and practice, really aiming to cultivate more change in food systems. And we're using a systems approach. We have over 105 affiliated faculty members, and we're also collaborating with many organizations, and many of you this evening are representatives of those organizations with whom we are collaborating. And we're really pleased to see so many friends from the community here this evening. Before introducing the speakers, I'd like to thank other partners who are co-sponsoring this event, and they include the College of Natural Resources, the Student Environmental Resource Center, the School of Public Health at Berkeley, and also the UC Global Food Initiative. I want to thank Rosalie Fanschel, our BFI's program manager, for her really amazing work to put all this together. Yay, Rosalie. And also Catherine Walsh of the Student Environmental Resource Center, Marcy Kaiser from the Alumni Hall here, the BFI Communications Assistant Danny Lee, Agnes Zhu, Dominique Campos, and many others who've contributed their time. Before introducing the speakers, I'd like to also acknowledge many people who are here this evening in the audience who are working actively together on efforts to address change in food systems. And as I said earlier this evening, the collective energy of so many people working together gives me hope about the future for overcoming injustices and working on change, to ensure that all people have more access to food that is produced equitably and sustainably and is affordable and nutritious. In fact, before we get started, I would like to get a sense of who is here tonight, representing many organizations and many different individuals from all facets of, I'm sure, of Berkeley area and beyond. How many of you are students? Raise your hands. Oh, we have quite a lot, great. And how about faculty? A few faculty members, great. And staff? Staff as well, okay. How about people from NGOs or community groups? Excellent. And any government agencies, representatives? Oh, not too many. Oh, come on. Afraid to raise their hands. Come on. How about businesses? Great. And farmers? Any farmers this evening? Well, I know we have a couple of them here. Okay. Well, it's great to have this diversity of people, again, because I think that all of us are doing a lot to make a difference in this movement, and we need to work together. So with that, I'd also now like to introduce our 4 speakers who are really remarkable leaders in the food movement. And there are quite a lot of details about the speakers in your program, but I'd like to just cover the highlights of our really honored and privileged to be able to introduce them to this evening. Our moderator tonight is Troy Duster. He's the Chancellor's Professor and Senior Fellow at the Warren Institute on Law and Social Policy, and he was formerly the Chair of the Department of Sociology and the Director of the Institute for the Study of Social Change at UC Berkeley. Professor Duster has held many important positions and honors, and some of which are mentioned in your program. The first panelist, after Troy makes an introduction, after Professor Dester begins, the first panelist is Ricardo Salvador, who's the Senior Scientist and Director of the Food and Environmental Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and formerly was a Program Officer on Food, Health, and Well-Being at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. And before that, he was a Professor of Agronomy at Iowa State University. And among many other things, Ricardo is really an amazing connector between NGOs, scientists, and politicians working on food system change. And then our next panelist will be Saru Jayaraman, who is a co-founder and co-director of the Restaurant Opportunities Center United and director of the Food Labor Research Center here at UC Berkeley. Saru was listed as CNN's top visionary women, among the CNN's top visionary women, and recognized by the White House as a champion of change recently. She is the author of a best-selling book called Behind the Kitchen Door and has many other recognitions for her outstanding work on labor rights and food systems. And finally, we have Mark Bittman, who is an award-winning journalist and columnist for the New York Times, author of many best-selling books, and has many more notable accomplishments. And now is our distinguished visiting fellow at the Berkeley Food Institute. And we're also very glad to report that that Mark is becoming increasingly a great fan of Berkeley. We call him being Berkeleyfied. So please join me in welcoming these four speakers. I really couldn't think of a better group of four people to be addressing this issue, so we're really honored to have these people with us today. Before handing off the mic, I'd like to point out an important piece of information, which is the fact that today is the birthday of Cesar Chavez. He would have been 88 years old today, and his birthday is recognized as a state holiday in California, Colorado, and Texas. So I'd like to encourage us to take this opportune moment this evening to reflect on the legacy of Cesar Chavez and to consider how far we've come and also how much work still remains to be done to overcome structures of extreme inequities and to cultivate systems of equity and justice in food and agriculture systems. It's a tall order, but I feel like we're working on those issues together. In Cesar Chavez's name, I think that's a good thing. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our moderator this evening, Professor Troy Dester, to begin the conversation. He's going to introduce the topic, and we'll move to the panelists who will give introductions, and then we'll begin questions and answers, first with Troy leading the group, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So thank you very much. You also have cards. You should have cards if you want to write questions. Begin to think of those questions, and we'll be collecting those a little later. So thank you again very much for coming.
Good evening and welcome to a forum on food systems, justice, and power. The term systems is appropriate because with food you have on the one end production, on the other end consumption. But in between there's distribution, regulation, and access. So a few years ago, Michael Pollan wrote a provocative piece in which he talked about the food movement. And he was describing its various tentacles and talked about how one could hardly see the nature and character of the coherence. And that is a natural feature of all social movements. That is, when you come to the point of trying to describe what a movement is, the more effective movements have various different prongs or tentacles. The idea of distribution, regulation, and access in between production and consumption means that you're going to have these various forms. So whether you have, let's say on the one hand, the organic movement, raw foods, anti-GMO, local, low-carbon imprint. I mean, all of those elements are part of a movement concerned about how the Farm Bill gets made up and then regulated, how it gets voted upon. That's the regulatory mechanism. And no one part of a movement could possibly capture the complexities of that whole system. So tonight we're going to try to talk about elements of the system and then try to put them together in ways that give us a larger picture. Now, once upon a time, Americans went to the grocery store and they had a list. There was a counter, literally a counter. And behind the counter was a clerk. And then there was the section for food behind even the clerk. So you passed the clerk a list, and he or she went back to get you your groceries. At mid-century, all of that changed, in part because there was research, marketing research. And they discovered that if people wandered up and down the aisles, even if they had a list, they would purchase many more products. And so on comes the 1960 to 2000, where there's this surge of consumer activity, and then this produces a certain kind of elements for those who are in production. Now, as I said, a movement has many tentacles, and I'd like to draw a parallel, very briefly, to the civil rights movement. On the one hand, you had the NAACP looking for a legal strategy, the courts. Then you had the Congress of Racial Equality looking for direct action, sit-ins. Then you had the Southern Christian Leadership Council, which was the morals position about nonviolence. And then there was SCLC, which is about voter registration. Those four groups, and there were many others, those four groups didn't much like each other. And so it is that one, in historical perspective, gets the big picture. They were all moving in the same direction, towards justice, towards a version of justice which each of them in their own way thought was the way, but many in the movement at the time felt that there was the wrong way, and there was what others were doing. So I want to draw a parallel to that, to the food movement. There are many aspects of this movement, and no movement is as coherent as it appears from the outside. But no movement is as incoherent as it appears from the inside. So if you're part of a movement, sometimes you think that the enemy are those people who have a different version, whether it's vegan or raw food and so on. Aren't they interested in the organic or the local and so on? So what I want to do is simply set the stage for this discussion and ask us to step back for a moment from the idea that there is a single avenue towards success. And issues of justice, issues of access, mobility, power, can be reconceptualized from different frames. Our task, it seems to me, is to get the big picture about how justice comes out of a full understanding of the movement. Now, with that, I want to turn to my colleagues and ask them to spend a few brief minutes, maybe about 7 to 10, outlining a particular version of what they regard as important. And then at the end of that period, we'll have a discussion among ourselves, and then as Ann indicated, I'll take questions from the audience. So with that, let me turn it over to Ricardo.
All of us are beneficiaries of a deeply unjust system, and it's something that requires urgent attention, something that none of us should leave this room believing that we can't do something about. If we fed ourselves by basically walking out the door, as Professor Felix Starkman advocates, and looking for what is edible, our population levels would be restricted to what an ecologist would call the carrying capacity of the particular ecosystem that we're in. So agriculturists are the people or the creatures that refuse that limitation. They increase the carrying capacity of their ecosystem. But it isn't that farmers are magicians and know some secret about how you can actually carry more organisms within a given biome. It is that we've learned to subsidize the productivity of particularly ideal places on the surface of the planet. And those subsidies we refer to as irrigation, fertilizer, herbicides, insecticides, and a variety of other names, key among which is labor. Agriculture globally is a system that exploits people and nature, and that's not an incidental feature of the system. It's baked into the system. For 10,000 years, we've done nothing but perfect that feature of the agricultural system, especially in the modern version of the system where we hide that exploitation behind the shiny technological sheen that most of us believe represents modern contemporary agriculture. So let me give you a simple analysis from the standpoint of an agronomist of both why this is and what can be done about it. Historically, the system that I'm about to describe has analogs in all parts of the world where agriculture is practiced. Here in the United States, it took this particular form. At around the time that this continent was settled, the social discipline, in other words, the human invention of economics, was also being formulated. And within that particular view of the world, the formulation that what is needed in order to be productive, what we measured as productivity, sounded something like this. We all needed to have access to basic factors of production in order to be productive, and these were access to land, access to labor, access to rent. If you wanted to define a poor person, you would find someone that didn't have access to at least one of those factors of production. So in the United States, we manifested the same trend that has existed since the beginning of agricultural history 10,000 years ago. The system that we now call modern contemporary agriculture began with a massive land grab and an episode of intentional genocide sanctioned by federal policies. This is the movement that opened up the land of the Midwest, where I taught for about 30 years, where children many generations after the deeds that I'm describing could honestly and with a straight face look at me and say, we are so blessed to have this land. And of course, I can't speak to the literal interpretation of whether we were blessed to have that land in Iowa where I taught, but I know there were deliberate actions taken just a few generations ago that explain why that land was in the hands of the farmers at that period of time. So massive land grab and genocide of the sort that we're decrying in other parts of the world at this moment was the way in which the system got started here. For a period of about 350 years, the labor to drive the agricultural system of this nation was driven by tearing families asunder on a separate continent, transporting them across the ocean, 12.5 million human beings, brutalizing them, exploiting them, and even after emancipation, literally separating them from the ability to benefit from the fruits of the wealth that their labor helped to create. And that is not history. If you know how to read today's headlines, you know that that is still going on. The message, remember your place, remember where you belong. A direct feature of the way in which the agricultural system of this nation was established. So different people now fulfill that labor requirement. The slave model still explains the way in which we provide the agricultural labor of this nation. We just call it by different names and sanction it with different laws. These laws take the form of creating exceptions to what the minimum wage should be for people that provide this labor, exemptions to occupational safety codes that you and I would expect in the place where we work, but don't apply to people working out in the fields exposed to toxics, and so on. So the point is that we all are beneficiaries of this deeply unjust system, which goes against the core of what we all claim are the core values of this nation, that exploitation. There is no rational world in which that can be a reality at the same time that we say that we live in a democracy. And I would like to ask all of us to ponder the question, in what world is asking to value the occupational safety, the health, the well-being, and the right to thrive of everyone participating in the food system an insurrectionary, wild idea? So that is the sort of system that we all need to be working to create. Mark and certain colleagues of ours have actually advocated for a coherent, coordinated approach to this nation's national food policy. And I would like to boil it down to the following principles for you. Whenever we set a policy affecting agricultural production, the food system of this nation, and our well-being, there should be a screen that we put it through. Is this law that I'm considering going to exploit people? Would it result in the exploitation of nature? Will it diminish the well-being of the population of this country? And if the answer to any of those is yes, we don't pass that law. That's not the kind of nation that we are.
Hi. Let me just get my phone. 1 second. How are you all tonight? Good. So, as you heard, my name is Saru, and I've spent the last, now 15 years working with workers throughout the food system and run a research center dedicated to looking at workers throughout the food system. There are actually right now 20 million workers in the United States food system. As a whole, the food system is the largest private sector employer in the United States. 1 in 5 private sector workers and 1 in 6 American workers in the United States works in some aspect of the food system, whether it be production, processing, that's meat and poultry processing, distribution, including warehouse workers, retail, grocery stores, and restaurants. And I've studied a lot of the workers throughout the food system, done a lot of research on different aspects of this chain. You may know that the segment of the industry, of the system that I've spent the most time looking at is the restaurant industry. And it just so happens that the restaurant industry of the 20 million workers is by far the largest segment of that system. So more than 11 million workers, more than half of all food system workers in the United States right now work in restaurants. In fact, the restaurant industry by itself, let alone the rest of the food system, is the second largest and absolute fastest growing private sector employer in the United States. It's 11 million workers. 1 in 12 Americans right now works in the restaurant industry. And yet the restaurant industry and the food system as a whole happen to be the absolute lowest paying employers in the United States. So every year, the US Department of Labor puts out a list of the 10 lowest paying jobs, like the Hall of Shame. And every year, we win the award. 7 of the 10 lowest paying jobs in the entire economy are restaurant jobs. And the 8th lowest paying job are farm workers. So 8 of the 10 lowest paying jobs in America are in the food system, which means, and I really want people who care about food to understand, the food system is not a bad employer. It is the absolute worst employer in the United States. And anybody who cares about anything related to sustainable food, if we cannot think about sustainable working conditions and wages as part of a sustainable food system, then we will never actually achieve any kind of sustainability in our lifetimes in the United States food system. It's just a fact, and the fact that the food system, and in particular restaurants and retail, are at the core of the immense and growing income inequality in America, the gap in wealth in America, that means that we have a responsibility, anybody who cares about food, to think about jobs, wages, and inequality in our country as a whole via the food system. So I have spent the last 10 years having multiple hats. I also run a national restaurant workers organization. We've done lots of things. We've organized workers to recoup about $10 million in stolen tips and wages from restaurant companies. We've opened a couple of restaurants called Colors across the country. We've trained thousands of workers. We've done lots of research and policy work. And the reason we've grown so fast over the last decade really is the explosion in this industry. It's huge, it's massive, it's growing, and our analysis as to how you've got the largest and fastest growing industry in America proliferating the absolute lowest paying jobs in the country is the power and influence of a trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association. We call it the other NRA. And again, here is a way in which the food system and people who care about food need to understand that inequality in our sector, in the restaurant sector, in the food system, impacts the economy as a whole. Because the other NRA is the most powerful lobby on Capitol Hill and in every state legislature on every issue affecting workers, and not just food system workers, and in particular on the minimum wage. So when I told this story in the past until recently, I would always tell the story of how the restaurant industry has gotten away with what it's gotten away with. And I will tell you that story very briefly, but I've been doing research for my next book and didn't realize that actually a lot of this dates back to slavery, also to slavery. This is going to be an evening of slavery. So if you ever wondered about the history of tipping in the United States, tipping actually didn't originate in the United States. Tipping originated in Europe, in the feudal homes of Europe. And when it came to America via rich Americans who traveled and wanted to show off when they came back to the States, Americans resoundingly rejected it. Even the states of Mississippi and Arkansas and Tennessee passed anti-tipping bans. They saw it as undemocratic and un-American. And there were two industries that squashed that movement, which, by the way, succeeded in Europe, and said, no, tipping is here to stay. It was, guess what? The restaurant industry and the Pullman train company. If anybody knows anything about labor history or racial justice history, you know that the Pullman car porters actually organized and said, no, we will not live off of tips, we need a wage. But both the restaurant industry and the Pullman train company both said, we want the ability to hire newly freed slaves and not pay them anything and let them live off of tips. And that was codified into law, into the very first minimum wage bill that was passed here in the United States, which meant that in 1938, when FDR passed the right to a minimum wage in 1938, the minimum wage for workers who earn tips in this country was $0. And we've gone up from $0 to now $2.13 an hour, which is the current federal minimum wage for tipped workers in these United States. Over an 80-year period, we've gone up $2.13 an hour. $2. And that wage of $2.13 an hour, it is between $2 and $5 in 43 states in the United States, including next door in Arizona. California is one of 7 states that actually requires employers to pay their own workers a wage, a full minimum wage. But in 43 states in the United States and at the federal level, the restaurant industry has gotten away with arguing that they should be the only industry on earth, because now we're pretty much the only country that does this, on earth, that shouldn't have to pay their own workers' wages, saying, you, the customers, should pay our workers' wages for us. And now we know that's a legacy of slavery. And how have they gotten away with it over the last 150 years? Since really 1850, they've gotten away with it by painting the picture of the average worker who earned tips as a white guy who works at Chez Panisse. They say he's doing great. He's earning $100,000 a year. There's no reason he should actually get a wage. When in fact, 70% of tipped workers in America are women. Women who work at IHOP and Applebee's and Olive Garden and Red Lobster. Women who suffer from 3 times the poverty rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce. Use food stamps at double the rate of the rest of the U.S. workforce, which means the women who put food on our tables can't actually afford to put food on their own families' tables. And even worse, they suffer from the absolute worst sexual harassment of any industry in the United States. Because when you're a woman who must live off of tips, you must tolerate whatever a customer might do to you, however they may touch you or treat you or talk to you, because the customer is always right. Now, 150 years later, we are finally seeing some change on this issue. My organization, ROC, together with folks at Berkeley, together with folks around the country, we've been leading a campaign called One Fair Wage, which is all about demanding that this industry, after 150 years, finally pay its own frickin' workers a wage, which should be something that's common sense, but is requiring a great deal of fight. And after so many years, we've actually got legislators in 7 states on the East Coast and in the District of Columbia moving legislation in both houses in those states to eliminate the lower wage for tipped workers altogether. We just won a huge victory in New York State. We raised the minimum wage for tipped workers almost to the full minimum wage. And it was huge. That's several 100,000 workers that just got a huge raise in New York State. We're going to see this victory in DC in a couple months. It's exciting. We're finally about to overcome this incredible legacy of slavery. And I think what's so incredible about this moment is that this change that we've seen, this historic change that's taken us about 10 years to get to this point, to fight the Restaurant Association, to finally get to the point where Congress and state legislatures are listening to us rather than listening to the Restaurant Association, is that we are part of an extraordinary moment of social upheaval among workers. Fast food workers are rising, and I know they have an event tonight. Walmart workers have risen and have won, right? They've won an extraordinary victory in that Walmart has felt forced to finally say we are going to pay our workers $10. Not a living wage, but a first step towards change. And none of that would have occurred, by the way, without workers actually going up against real targets of corporate power, real corporate power, and saying we demand change. And so this is my challenge to the broader food movement. First of all, as I've said, there's no way to think about sustainable food without thinking about sustainable wages and working conditions for the people inside of it. That's number one. But number two, I think the food movement has something to learn from the workers in the food system, which is that alternatives are wonderful. It is wonderful to think about alternatives. It is wonderful to think about an alternative society in which cooperatives and all of the alternative food products that we create flourish and do well. But unless we're actually directly attacking corporate power that controls our democracy and our economy and our lives, we will not succeed. That is very, very necessary to create the kind of actual change we need on all of the issues we're going to talk about tonight. So we need both. We need, yes, to be thinking about alternatives, but if we are not, like the workers, directly going up against the National Restaurant Association and Walmart and every other corporate power that is stopping us from getting what we really need in terms of a just food system, we will never achieve it. Thank you.
I just told my friend Saru that I hated her. Actually, hate panels. I'm really honored to be here, and I know that I'm honored to be here because I hate panels, and panels are really like the luck of the draw. If you get to go first, this is not in any way directed at you were fabulous. You get to go first, you say what you want, and it's fresh, and it's new, and it's wonderful. You get to go last after people like this. You've heard it all. So I will keep this short because I think the discussion, this is a forum, I think we want to bring out new ideas. And I do have some things to say, and I'd like to say them, but I will be a little shorter than the other speakers. I want to ask what justice means. Because the biggest change in the food movement in recent history has been the addition of the word justice to the conversation. This forum would not have happened 5 years ago. So you look in the dictionary, what's justice? Fairness, equity, impartiality, honesty, righteousness. It's not only that little of these things exist in our food system, but that they don't exist in our society at large. And we've reached the point, as Saru just said, we've reached the point where we're recognizing that the food system cannot be addressed independently of the economic and political systems. When the bathtub upstairs leaks and the ceiling caves in and it ruins your furniture and it ruins your floor, it's not enough to call the plumber. There may be better analogies, but you get the idea. This matters because, simply put, the big changes that have to happen for food to be just, that is, for food to be fair, affordable, nutritious, and green, food that nourishes, in the real sense of the word, the land, the people who grow it and manufacture it and transport it, and the people who eat it. The changes that must happen for all of that to occur are way too big to be handled under the current economic system. What I'm saying is that we can't have food justice in the corrupt oligarchical form of capitalism that's running the show right now. We can't, for example, rein in monoculture without reining in profits. We can't rein in junk food in a meaningful way without reining in profits, which means we probably can't rein in the literally hundreds of billions of dollars worth of chronic diseases caused by bad diets or the miserable working conditions of tens of millions of people without reining in profits. It's simply not logical and it's simply not possible. If profits rather than people's needs dictate what gets produced, well, then we're going to have monoculture, we're going to have environmental damage, we're going to have products that come closer to the dictionary definition of poison than food. We're going to have injustice, we're not going to have equity or fairness. It doesn't mean that I'm sitting here advocating armed revolution, standing here advocating armed revolution. Nor does it mean that incremental change is impossible. In fact, incremental change is critical. If we can get, for example, an end to the tipped minimum wage, a sizable increase in the minimum wage, or even better, a guaranteed basic income. If we can get the routine use of antibiotics out of the food supply, if we can begin to protect young people from the rapacious marketers of soda and other junk food, we can make huge strides that will positively affect the lives of just about every single person living in this country. And we can continue to show that change is possible. And a belief that change is possible is just about the most critical belief we can instill in people right now. If you question that moronic Reagan-era metaphor that a rising tide lifts all boats, which in fact, literally and obviously it does, but that has nothing to do with economics. And therefore you question the notion that all wealth stems from profit, you appear to be attacking the very foundations of American society. And in a way you are, because our society has become a perverted notion of what it was, and far more important, what it potentially could be. But in a way, you're pledging to fight for liberty and justice for all. And rather than being un-American, you're being truly patriotic. To think about real justice is to imagine the transformation not only of the food system, but of every system: production, education, health, transportation, energy, infrastructure, safety, you name it. And we need that imagination. We can create our own forms of justice, and it's important that we do. Alternative systems matter. But alternative systems can go only so far given the limitations imposed by the status quo. Justice means not only creating better ways of doing things, but attacking the existing harmful ones. As a friend of mine always says, there's plenty of good work to be done. Thank you.
All right, so let's begin with a discussion among us. I'll start with a kind of repeating of a framing question in my introduction. Namely, one can approach this topic from the point of view of regulation, policy, top-down. Or one can approach it from mobilization, grassroots activity, and bottom-up. That's an arbitrary distinction, and the two are related, because when you have effective mobilization from the base, policy can change. But the question is this: from where you sit, any of you, what do you see in the various aspects of the food movement that seem most likely to have an effect on policy regulation? What do you see as the capacity of mobilization to affect policy?
Well, I'm an organizer, so I believe fundamentally that change occurs when the people most affected come together, organize, create their build collective power. And then this is the part that I think a lot of the food movement as it exists right now, or some of it, I should say, not all of it, but some of it misses, which is that they don't just come together and build collective power, they target power. They engage in direct action against power imbalances. They think about power imbalances and they target direct action against power imbalances. So what does that mean? That means fast food workers organizing and targeting McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, outside of these restaurants, demanding change, going to shareholder meetings, demanding change, going to the fundamental sources of power and demanding that change. It means restaurant workers, organizing against the National Restaurant Association, organizing against large restaurant companies like Darden, which owns Olive Garden and Red Lobster, and organizing in these companies. I think, for me, what will create change in this country is absolutely mobilization and organizing, and we're seeing it right now. Frankly, as an organizer, I feel more hope in this moment than I have felt in the last 20 years. There's a real moment of social upheaval. It is because people are organizing and demanding change, both in the economic justice space, in the racial justice space, people are demanding change. So there's real hope, there's real organizing, and I guess what I believe is that I think the food movement should step into this moment by looking at the possibilities for organizing in ways that don't just build collective power at the grassroots and stay there, but actually build collective power in a way that targets those that hold the power over our food system, and in my opinion, that is corporations.
Well, I can only gild that a little bit. The first thing, which is the preamble, is that all of us have observed the truth of what Saru has just mentioned, and that probably one of the most significant things that has happened over the last 10 years, Mark also mentioned this, was the rise in the public consciousness of the issue of justice, and that has been manifested by the fact that some of the biggest victories that have occurred over the last 10 years have been those of the food movement. So groups such as ROC, groups such as the Farm Chain or the Food Chain Workers Alliance and so on that have risen up and caused the changes that we've just heard Saru describe. So that is basically just a preamble really to the comment that Saru just made. Something else that is implicit in that comment is that we really do need to form common cause, develop strategies, get into that messy work that you described. It looks differently whether you're inside of it or outside of it, but form the power of what we're referring to in an aspirational sense as the food movement, and create a reality of a food movement where all of the linked groups that have a stake in improving the exploitative system that we've described here tonight come up not only with the need to change that, but also with the better ideas to replace that. Because both of those things working together make the argument more credible and coherent when you advance against power structures. The issue of power structure is a slightly different thing, although we've seen examples in the food labor movement that they've identified what the single biggest vulnerable point of the system is, and that is its brand, its image with its customers, and attack that directly so that they've gotten disproportionate outcomes from very small actions when you look at the number of people involved, and moving the behemoth of corporate interests who absolutely cannot stand for crowds of people in front of their retail outlets, given manifest proof that they are enslavers and exploiters of people. So that sort of crafty analysis with the alternatives built in, I think, are the sorts of things that we need to be really intentional in organizing about.
I don't think it's a coincidence that the most successful part of what we call the food movement in the last few years has been around labor. Because the labor movement predates the food movement. And we could call it part of the food movement, but it really is a labor movement. And the labor movement has been what's moved the needle in American politics for 150 years, if not longer. People, you know, it goes back to, it's the economy, stupid. People are affected by what affects them directly and what they feel most directly. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't be talking about climate change, the environment, animal welfare, antibiotics, as I said, marketing of junk food to children. All of these things are critically important, but we have an opportunity here to make the food movement meld with something bigger, and that something bigger is a struggle for workers' rights. And that, I think, is what's happening right now. I think that's what we've seen. It's really only been 5 years. We really would not, Saru would have been having this discussion 5 years ago. Maybe Ricardo would have been. I wouldn't have been here. Many other people wouldn't have been having this conversation. It is a live conversation now. It's really happening, and it has energy. And I think all of us, amazing how many people I know here, but all of us who are here would probably agree that this has been the best year since we started working on the food movement, since we started talking about the food movement. We have had more victories than we've had in the last 10 years. And a lot of those have been around labor. So that is a very key issue right now.
Okay. We'd like to also get questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please write them on a card and pass them to the outside aisle. And we'll collect them and I'll take a look at them. In the meantime, because I knew I was going to be moderating this panel, I was paying particular attention to media accounts of what's happened in the last short period. And indeed, beginning this month, here are 3 quick stories. Number 1, March 4th, McDonald's announced that in the next 24 months, only chickens raised without antibiotics will be used. That's number 1. Number 2, the next day, the New York Times reported a national study in which school children increased their choice and consumption of fruit. It shifted from 54% in 2012, 67% this year. It's a dramatic trend line. And then just last Friday, the Associated Press reported for the 10th straight year, consumer purchases of sodas has dropped dramatically. So that's the consumption side, okay? So when consumers, unlike the early period I mentioned where you go to the clerks and give them a list, when consumers have the capacity to assess what's happening, then you have the capacity for mobilization, at least on the consumer side. Production side is more complicated, and indeed labor. I think you just hit those 2 issues exactly. The labor movement has been under attack here for the last 50 years, and that's because labor was associated with industrial labor. The great movements of the 30s and the 40s were about industry, and of course we've reached the point where I think now less than 12% of the US economy is in industry. And what proportion is in agriculture? Probably less than, 4%? So we've got a very small base in terms of the whole economy to work with in terms of labor movement. But that could be the flip side. You can see in that adversity advantage. When you've got that concentration on a particular way of doing work, it may be you have a capacity to target. So I guess my question is this. The half-empty bottle is that labor is under attack, and has been, and effectively, and now increasing number of states controlled by Republican governors. But those also are many of the states where there's farm workers. What's the way of even thinking about that, where you've got attack on labor, mobilization on the far right, effectively by the Republican Party, and yet where we see the potential is with the mobilization of workers. There's a tension here.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say, I definitely don't see the food system or the food conversation being limited to agricultural workers or farm workers. So, yeah, farm workers there are about 4 or 5 million farm workers in America. There are 20 million workers in the entire food system, and I think increasingly we have to look at the entire chain. And Ricardo mentioned the Food Chain Workers Alliance. I created the Food Chain Workers Alliance back in 2008. I pulled together organizations of workers throughout the food system because all of us individually, kind of as you're talking about, we're bumping up against not just the far right and the attacks on the labor movement, but frankly even up against the food movement. As Mark was mentioning, we're talking even, this was 2008, so 7 years ago, the food movement did not recognize workers as part of the conversation. So all of us were individually bumping up against thinking, there was a lot to learn from the food movement. I think, we've been talking about how the food movement can learn from workers. I think that we found that there was a lot to learn from the food movement in terms of consumer activism, in terms of consumers actually changing an industry. So we wanted to be part of that. We wanted to connect to that. We wanted consumers to care about workers as well. So we created the Alliance to consolidate our power as workers throughout the entire food system. So we don't see ourselves as 5 million farm workers. We see ourselves as 20 million food system workers, including restaurant workers, retail, food processing workers, all of these workers. And seen as such, I think we have a lot more power, a lot more potential, and that is now being seen through the fast food workers and the Walmart workers rising, even in Republican states, even when there are attacks on labor. And I think the labor movement, which I don't think is just dying because they've been seen as industrial. I think there is an onslaught from corporate America, an onslaught on labor movement, and there has been for the last 100 years that has really impacted, in particular, labor law, making it very difficult to actually organize unions in the United States. And so thus, what's happening in the food space among food workers, I think even more than the rest of the economy, is that workers in the food space are finding all kinds of new and different ways to organize outside of the traditional National Labor Relations Act, which is the law that governs unions, and over the last 80 years has become worse and worse and worse and more anti-worker. So you're finding some of the most exciting activities in the new labor movement in food. I mean, think about it. Fast food workers, Walmart workers, restaurant workers, food service workers on college campuses. Most of the most exciting, innovative, creative, and attention-grabbing worker activity right now is happening in the among food workers. So there is a real opportunity for the food movement and these new workers who are organizing to come together and beat back the Republican onslaught, the right-wing onslaught. But the only way to do that is to identify the source of the right-wing attacks, the source of its power, which is corporate America, and the ways in which corporate America has really controlled our democracy. I mean, and I'm not just talking on labor issues, right? If you look at any of the issues that the food movement cares about, it's about deregulation, it's about corporate officers and executives, having a revolving door on regulating agencies that govern organic and, almost everything that we care about in food. So anyway, I think now there's a true moment of opportunity, especially because so much of America beyond labor cares about, actually does care about fairness, inequality, and the ways in which corporate America is taking too much power.
So I again, can only gild that, but there's a couple of additional points. And so to your last point, Saru, around identifying really where this assault is coming from and what the power is that we're contesting. I noticed that in part of our discourse here, we've gotten partisan, which I don't want to be naive about. But digging a little bit underneath that, both of the viable parties in this country are very broad, very diverse coalitions. The conversation made me think of some actual science on the question of how our government works and how representative it is, whose interests are actually manifested through our laws. That was published by researchers from Princeton and Northwestern last year sometime, I think probably in spring of last year, if I remember correctly, where the research was basically to line up about 20 years worth of federal policies that have been passed in this nation, and to look at who would benefit from the passage of about 1,800 different laws. Did the laws represent public interest all the way to corporate interest? Who would be the primary beneficiaries? And what the research demonstrated was that overwhelmingly, the laws that actually get passed at the federal level benefit the corporate sector, and not just the corporate sector, but the top 10% of the corporate sector. And they had set up the study so that they had 4 different preconceptions about how representative our democracy actually is. And so what the research demonstrated was that, in fact, we do not have not a democracy, not a representative democracy, but an actual oligarchy by the dictionary definition. And that is that the laws that get passed overwhelmingly represent the interest of a very small sliver of the corporate sector. Now it happens that they are part of this coalition, their interests are represented under this part of the coalition of the Republican Party. But I think it is very important to dig down and talk about numerically whose interests are actually being represented by that. Now, one other thing to mention that I think is really important about the issue of the food system labor in this country is something that we sweep under the rug and that we actually need to confront. And that is the fact that, at least in the agricultural fields of this nation and throughout the entire food system, the legal status of those workers to be in the country is one inextricable feature of that population. And again, that is not incidental, because it means that that population is politically weak and exploitable. So this means that we need to confront the fact that there is a series of jobs, as Saru very pointedly described that are not only bad jobs, but the worst jobs in the nation that we will not do for ourselves, effectively are outsourcing. So that exploitation that I was referring to is sanctioned by the fact that we not only create a siphon for that labor, because we ourselves will not perform it, we furthermore exploit it once it's here. So we need to recognize that that's what we're doing. As I said, if we believe that that's not the country that we want to live in, then that needs to be fixed. So at one time, namely, all of you are aware, particularly in this state, when the similar situation manifested as a result of the native labor force leaving to fight the Second World War, there were legal provisions to bring in the labor force that then took over agriculture. That was what set the pattern for the exploitative system that we have right now. Those laws were allowed to expire so that now we don't have the legal cover and now we just have the exploitation. So that is a piece of work that actually needs to be confronted. That's a very concrete thing that needs to change in immigration policy.
Good. Mark, before we go on, I wanted to sort of synthesize these 2 points and ask you the question like this. I also was aware of this study out of Northwestern, concentration of power, the work by Stiglitz and Piketty on distribution between rich and poor, and how it's increased over the last 3 decades. All right. That means we have power concentration, oligarchical tendencies in the Congress and in the various states, indicating to me that an attempt to move government policy through those who are in those seats in Congress and in state legislatures is probably a fool's errand. The power concentration is so great, and that and the legislatures and the Congress are so much purchased by power, that the attempt to go to the regulatory mechanisms, farm bills, as a way of getting some kind of redress is probably doomed, which leaves us with mobilization.
It does leave us with mobilization, but you can't give up on the power of regulation, which will follow, as the White House has said many, many times. If you force regulation on us, we will enact regulation. That comes from mobilization, and that comes from political power. There comes a point at every public gathering where someone winds up talking about voting patterns and campaign finance reform. And that is really, really key. To go back to those 3 examples from the press of the last couple of weeks that you brought up, they're examples of both the power and the failure of regulation. If you think that it's a success, well, I think we all think that it's a nice thing that McDonald's is voluntarily withdrawing antibiotics from chickens. They did the same thing by announcing that they were not going to buy pork that had been raised using gestation crates a couple of years ago. As Saru and I were talking about a couple of days ago, actually, it's very nice that Walmart is promising to raise its workers' wages. But all of these things are, to some extent, PR ploys. They're not unreal, but they're PR ploys, and they're pushed so far down the road that it's sort of inevitable that these things are going to happen by then anyway. So McDonald's announcing they're not going to buy chicken with antibiotics is not, it's a victory for McDonald's, but it's a demonstration of the failure of our government to outlaw the use of antibiotics in raising chickens. The fact that we have to rely on McDonald's to voluntarily do this is problematic. The same thing is true of reduced consumption of soda. Reduced consumption of soda is a marketing success on the part, or at least a marketing recovery on the part of the pushers of sugar-sweetened beverages, because the consumption of sugar-sweetened beverages is in fact not down, it's up. It's just that other things have taken the place of soda. Cynical things, even more, if something could be more cynical than soda, it's vitamin water. And vitamin water didn't exist 10 years ago, and sales are through the roof. Red Bull didn't exist 10 years ago. We all know where that's at. So this is not the power of regulation. This is not the power of education. This is the power of marketing to successfully adjust itself to shifting consumer desires. The one success that you mentioned, is the increase in the consumption of fruit and vegetables on the part of kids. And the best, I would say the single best thing the Obama administration has done in the realm of food is improve school lunches and concentrate on child nutrition. Needless to say, this is being fought with as much energy as they can muster by conservatives, reactionaries in Congress. But this stands as a demonstration of the power of regulation, of the ability of government to change people's lives for the better. And we have got to believe that those kind of changes are possible, whether through mobilization, whether through changing voting patterns, whether through changing campaign finance reform. We have got to believe that that's possible, because mobilization can only take us so far.
Good. Okay, personal note, Edible Schoolyard Foundation. 10, 15 years ago, I was doing some research with local schools here. I stood and watched students making choices at the cafeteria, and the overwhelming majority of them were taking not the fruit and the salad. They were taking, here in Berkeley. 10 years later, there's been a shift. And the story that I just gave you is a national story, but it's true here in Berkeley. And I think the Edible Schoolyard Foundation can take some credit with over now 4,000 different sites around the globe playing this role. So now to the audience. What actions do you think can be taken to build alliances between aspects of the food movement?
Well, we're actually being intentional about that. And so it begins with having a structure within which representatives of the different sectors can actually begin to have conversations about what would be better for them. So it doesn't start out with assuming what they would want or representing what they would want, but actually getting people in a room and saying, what would be better for you as a farmer, as a farm laborer, as a food chain worker, and
what
so on.
kind of sites, what kind of forums, what kind of situations make that possible?
Okay, well, so this isn't theoretical. We're actually engaged in setting up those kinds of conversations at the moment, and they take place on site. Actually, here in Oakland, some of these meetings have been happening, and some of them are phone conferences, but these conferences or these conversations are actually beginning as we speak.
Any other responses on how to mobilize, how to create alliances between aspects of the movement?
I mean, I'm working with Ricardo on some of these things, so I'm behind what he just said. There are, I think that there are some big issues that we need to coalesce around. I mentioned them in my prepared remarks. I think there are some victories that we can win. I think minimum wages is certainly one of them. I think antibiotics in the food supply is another. I think fighting the fight over marketing junk to children is another. I think there are issues that are big and that are winnable, and I think there are issues that are small and maybe people are wasting their time on. And I don't think this is the place to get into the nitty-gritty of that, but I do think that it's important for us to define what the major issues are, what we can unite around. As you said at the outset, this is messy. There are going to be disagreements, but there have to be big issues that come to the fore, and that 70, 80, 90% of us who are concerned about this can agree upon and say, here's where our energy is going to go right now.
Okay. All right, this is a difficult question. Let me read it slowly. With the oceans dying, with fossil fuels running out, with the drought worsening and freshwater supplies dwindling, with global population growing, can we realistically feed all peoples without a greater ecosystem collapse while providing food justice for all? Whoa.
Yes, no question. The answer is yes.
All right.
Can I say something about that?
Feel free.
You know, I didn't get to answer your first question about different aspects of the food movement coming together, and I've spent the last 8 or 9 years thinking about that, especially thinking about how workers can be part of a broader fight for food justice, of the broader food movement. That's why I created the Food Labor Research Centers, to think about how do people who care about food and people who care about workers, or people who are affected by food and workers, actually come together. And I think that's wonderful and exciting, and I think the effort that Ricardo and Navina and Mark and others are part of is, the Food Chain Workers Alliance, I'm fully behind that. I think actually at this moment, the conversation is even broader, and it relates in part to the ecological crisis. It relates in part to actually what I think is happening in America, which, with Black Lives Matter and really a real call at this moment for racial justice. I think it's even broader than the various aspects of the food movement coming together. Frankly, it's various aspects of social justice, people who care about social justice, people who care about the fight against the total imbalance of power in our nation, the oligarchy, right? Coming together around people power. And so to that end, I've been a part of bringing together climate justice folks, food justice folks, Black Lives Matter folks, labor folks, people working on criminal justice reform, people working on gentrification, together in a cohesive movement, bringing together fights against the state and fights against capital in a race and gender-centered framework, to really think about common moments of mobilization, common potential policies we want to fight on together, common themes and memes and frames that will help us build power across our movements. Part of it, frankly, was inspired by one of Mark's columns that was in fall of last year, titled, "Is It Bad Enough?" That really, I think we all are feeling this moment of, I used to say it feels like another 60s, but people have said, stop saying that. It's not the 60s, it's our moment, it's another moment, it's this moment. And this moment is a moment of social upheaval and rising expectations across movements. And my question to the food movement is, how will the food movement step into this moment of social upheaval and rising expectations and a desire to change inequality and corporate control in a real way that stands beside the labor movement and the racial justice movement?
And the next question is for you. It says, for Saru. How do you envision the cooperative movement playing a role in advancing justice within the food system?
Yeah, so, I will answer, and maybe you guys have other thoughts. So I started a cooperatively owned restaurant in New York, and started another one in Detroit, and then in those restaurants have actually incubated and spawned other worker-owned cooperatives, which are wonderful and amazing and important, but will not transformation create. And I say that because, again, I see them as part of building our alternative vision of society, which is wonderful and excellent and very, very necessary. But if they are not grounded within a broader movement to actually fight against power in this country and who holds both political power and economic power and power over our democracy, then by themselves, they are not enough. They are not enough. They are not transformative on their own. So I think cooperatives are important if they are part of a broader movement to organize people for power. Yeah.
Well, I would just say, I think we'd all agree that change needs to come from, you said this at the beginning, needs to come from so-called bottom and so-called top. I think similarly, we need to build alternative systems. We need to build cooperatives, not so much because we believe that that's the panacea and that it's going to change things in a huge and permanent way, but so that we can experiment and see the effect of these things, so that we can, as I know this is sounding like a love fest, but as Ricardo said to me a couple of weeks ago, it's a little bit like a balloon. You poke it in one place and you see where it changes in another. So you build something and you see what its effects are, and some things are going to be more successful than others, and we need a longer range view than many of us are capable of taking. And we need to say, Yes, of course, we're interested in immediate change, but we also are interested in what happens 30 years from now. Can we look that far ahead? Can we make some changes now and say, how can we compound the positive effects of these changes? And I think of this discussion we had with Wes Jackson a year and a half ago or so, where he was saying, you're not going to kill the industrial food system overnight, but you can help slowly starve it to death. And you can starve it to death by building some alternative institutions. That's definitely part of the solution.
All right, so this question is sort of pure Berkeley question. History suggests that capitalism will adjust itself to challenges in order to forestall systemic change. Why won't that be the case with Walmart's wage increases and other similar responses? How do wage increases then lead to a deeper set of structural changes? It's a Berkeley question.
I mean, I will just give my thoughts on this. I talked a lot about the tip minimum wage, which is part of the wage conversation going on right now in the United States. And, I sometimes, Mark, we talk about these are small changes you're fighting for. I mean, sometimes I do sit, when I'm about to go to sleep, I think, my God, I'm basically spending my life fighting to make sure that workers are paid a wage. And it's 2015, and I'm spending my life fighting just to make sure that workers actually get a wage from their employer rather than having to rely on customer tips, which seems absurd and incremental. But I think for us, this particular fight about making the National Restaurant Association pay its own workers isn't actually just about getting workers a $10 or $15 wage increase. That's actually not what it's about. That's a big part of it, and workers, 30 million workers in America would be lifted out of poverty, which is wonderful. But what it actually fundamentally is about is a bigger question, which is who gets to determine, who gets to set the rules in this country? Who gets to determine how a woman is treated in the workplace? Who gets to determine whether a worker actually gets a wage or not? Who gets to say whether a worker can work for nothing and live off of customer tips? Is it we the people, or is it corporate trade lobbies like the National Restaurant Association? Are we truly a democracy? Are we truly a democracy is the fundamental question that I think this is about. And so the fight among Walmart workers to increase wages, the fight among restaurant workers to actually get a wage, the fight among fast food workers is not actually just about $15. It's about power. It's fundamentally about power, because this is a short-term fight towards the longer-term fight, which is really ultimately, in our case, to counterbalance the power of the National Restaurant Association in our nation. It is to counterbalance the power of Walmart over our world. It is the ultimate desire to counterbalance the power over fast food corporations over the way we eat and live in this country. So how will we overcome capitalism? We will engage in fights that are partly about winning things and partly about building power towards the larger fight, which is about balancing power and about people actually controlling this democracy.
All right, I have two more questions, and then we're going to close. Are star chefs, gentrified urban districts with gourmet food, and restaurant critics really part of the food movement?
I love the yes/no question.
All right.
Star chefs.
I had to, I'm committed to.
Anyone who struggles for change for the better in the world of food is part of the food movement. So it's a difficult thing to generalize. If the question would be, is the Food Network part of the food movement? I would have to say no. If the question is, are chefs like Tom Colicchio and Alice Waters part of the food movement? Obviously, the answer is yes. So it's not quite that simple. If people are fighting and struggling around issues in food in a good way, then they're part of the food movement.
I was sort of hinting at that with my remarks at the beginning, that if you take the long historical view of any movement, you get to see it's in the direction of change. Okay, last question. Can you get to the matter of what individuals can do And this question apparently has come up at least on 4 or 5 different of these cards, a different form of it. But it's about individuals and what they can do in this circumstance to increase justice, truth, beauty.
I have a short answer to that, and then the two of you can say the really intelligent stuff. I thought about this a lot because that question is never, I don't know that I've been at a talk in the last couple of years where that question hasn't come up, and I think maybe this demonstrates why I actually belong in Berkeley, because I've come to the point where I think the answer is really, if you bring passion to the work that you're doing, you bring passion around making food better to the work that you're doing, that's as good as it gets. It goes without saying that we should be working for social change. It goes without saying that we should be working for electing better public officials. And it also goes without saying that we're all seeing that change is happening more quickly on municipal and state levels than it is on federal levels. But I think that for individuals, there's nothing that you're doing in your life that you can't bring a passion for good food, for better food, and for food justice to. And that's vague, I recognize, but I think it's simply true.
So I mentioned that I think right at this moment there's a lot that the food movement, and I'm teaching social movements right now, so there is a specific definition that some theorists have used of what a social movement is, and it's debatable as to whether what we're calling the food movement is a true. Social movement. I think there are true aspects of the food movement that are a social movement. But I think there's a lot to learn from the workers in the food movement. I think we as labor, in the labor sphere, have a lot to learn from the food movement in terms of reaching a really wide mass audience of consumers who really did change my industry, the restaurant industry. I mean, I remember 10 years ago, restaurants in New York saying, we'll never be able to afford locally sourced organic cuisine. And now those same restaurants 10 years later saying, we provide locally sourced organic cuisine, whether or not they actually do, right? And I think, so that is definitely a shift that has come about because consumers asked when they ate out, is this local, is this organic? Like the Portlandia sketch that I don't know how many of you have seen, does the chicken have a buddy? Did the chicken grow up well? Does the chicken have friends on the farm? Those things are important, but the thing that I really don't want us to take that and then run with is the idea that we can shop our way out of these problems. That, I think, is the wrong way of thinking. So the idea that you can go to a farmer's market instead of the grocery store, or buy an organic tomato instead of a regular tomato, and that is the solution to the problems we've all been talking about, and that would make us feel good and we can go home and that's the end. The problem with that is that we then cede the political sphere to the corporations that have put out the organic tomato and the regular tomato and every kind of tomato in this moment. We cede the political sphere to those that control our food system. And so it cannot just be about shopping differently, certainly asking questions. We actually created an app. So in our case, how can consumers participate, help workers? We created an app to tell you, it's called the ROC National Diners Guide, and it tells you how restaurants around you are faring on issues of wages and benefits and promotions. But we actually didn't create the app to tell you where to eat and where not to eat, because we don't believe that shopping differently or going to a different restaurant is going to change the restaurant industry. We created the app to give you a tool to speak up every time you eat out, or at least every couple of times you eat out, because you may not want to do it every time. Go up to not the server who has no power, but the owner or the manager and say, I love the food, I love the service, but I would love to see you do well by this app, because the criteria on this app, wages, benefits, and promotions practices, are actually really important to me as a consumer, right? That's different than just going to a different restaurant and feeling good about yourself. It's actually communicating your values to the industry, and we hope ultimately to the political system. So using the app, getting engaged politically, these things, I think, are the most important thing that people can do.
Great, thanks.
I can only say the same thing for the third time. We cannot not participate in the system that we've been describing. That again, as has been said earlier, would be a fool's errand. But this point that Saru has just made about ceding political power, I think is probably the largest explanation for what we've got. If you think, this is twisting a little bit one of the questions, I forget whether you posed it or whether it came from the audience around cooperatives. So stretching that just a little bit for the sake of making a point, the sorts of interests that have created the world that we would like to see reformed are cooperatives of a sort. They have a common interest, they're working together, they've developed strategies, they work very intentionally to create the realities that we've talked about, and by and large, they have a clear running field ahead of them. Because, as I've said, the majority of us are beneficiaries of this system that essentially allows us to not think about the food that we eat, where it came from, how it's produced, what's involved in getting us to it. We are genuine beneficiaries of that. The single biggest thing that system gives us is convenience. It saves us time. And we love that because of the sort of lifestyle that we have created for ourselves. And this system, the food is almost incidental. And so these sorts of benefits are the sorts of things that are marketed to us and that we just joyously, happily accept without realizing what else we're getting in the bargain. So it isn't sufficient just to act as individuals and saying, I now realize that these are features of the system that I don't personally support. We need to realize that there are concerted efforts, this is not a conspiracy theory, there are concerted efforts as manifested by the series of policies that we've sprinkled throughout the conversation this evening that are put there to make sure that in the interaction between the corporate interests that we've been describing, which expect a stable political environment, for the public to build the infrastructure that benefits their business operations, for us to look the other way when they exploit labor, for us just to enjoy the nirvana of eating whatever we want, whenever we want, and as much of it as we want for a small proportion of our income, we actually need to respond in kind. So the cooperatives that you were describing, if you take them literally, you're thinking about associations of producers and the different sectors that are involved. They also should involve the public as a whole, saying, to both of those pillars of interest in the system, that this is not the system that we are supporting. As I've said already, this is not the nation that we want to live in. And I concluded my remarks with a screen that I think would either bring us the change that we want or expose the hypocrisy of the nation that we live in. Either way, it should motivate change.
Great. Okay, with that, let me end with a couple of crisp formulations. The first one, borrowed from the Civil Rights Movement, which goes something like this in its distilled form. You're part of the solution or you're part of the problem. And on the matter of individual action, let me take a page from C. Wright Mills, who said, our task is to try to convert individual troubles into public issues. And the issue of engagement, therefore, is not simply, as Saru and others have said, whether you buy the right kind of food at the right kind of market, whether it's vegan, organic, raw, and so forth. It's whether or not in that activity you can push forward the notion that what you're doing as an individual engages a more public, social, political framework. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank our three panelists, ask you to join me, and invite Anne to summarize and give the last remarks. First of all, thanks to the panel.
I also just want to thank the panelists very much. It would be very difficult to try to do any additional summary. I think this is an incredibly interesting and provocative and excellent discussion. So thank you all for your time and great contributions. I also want to say that we had many excellent questions from the audience. We have a stack, and it was a great exercise or a challenge of trying to be just and equitable to select ones. It's really difficult, but anyway, we have a whole collection. We'd love to go on further if we could. I'm sure go on all night when addressing these very interesting and important questions. But thank you for your participation and offering questions as well. With that, I just really thank you all for coming today. I'm sure many of you in the audience also have great things to contribute to this dialogue and discussion and are contributing to make efforts in the importance of working on justice and equity in the food system. So with that, I just want to, again, let's give a round of applause for our wonderful speakers.